Earlier today, there was mention of using a playbook one week, and the next week you need a new playbook. The threat actors are taking that mentality, so are we. And so as we get started, I'm going to introduce myself and then allow the panel to, and then we'll dive into it. So I'm Max Henderson, Director of Incident Response at Pondurance.
I'm Larry Crocker. I'm the head of the incident response practice here at AtBay.
I'm Kelly Garrison. I am a breach attorney at Fisher Broyles.
And my name is Brian Smith. I'm the section chief for the FBI Cyber Criminal Operations Section, based out of D.C. Been with the Bureau for about 20 years. Before that, did consulting for Deloitte and Anderson.
I'm Greg Batista, partner with Mullen Coughlin.
Awesome. So we're going to talk about a lot of different trends, and we're going to kind of hone in on specific key areas as we get through that. So the first area that I at least want to talk about is the trends in extortion. So ransomware traditionally started with encryption, right? And then there's the data exfil component to it as well. One key area that I want to highlight, and I'll allow everybody to highlight perhaps another key area that they found challenges in. But we're starting to see a large uptick in the ransomware actors actually calling the victim. Sometimes not just calling the victim, but calling the victim's family, calling employees as the entire negotiation or non-negotiation process carries out. And it almost seems, and I'm so excited for this report to come out one day, but it almost seems as if they're hiring a call center to facilitate it. And so what are some of the challenges that we're seeing when we see these different forms of harassment? And perhaps within the different forms of harassment, what are you seeing as far as techniques go? Larry, we'll start with you.
Sure. So, I've done a lot of cases involving negotiations, working with the client and breach counsel. Obviously, we don't do anything without a breach counsel, carriers, everyone's and the client's permission. But what we're seeing a lot is as we're going through these negotiation phases, some of the threat actors are reaching out via text message, via phone calls. One of the biggest things that we've seen here lately is they're DDoSing the websites of the company, especially if they're a city government. They have their websites up. They're hitting them pretty hard, and it also depends on the threat actor, which one it is. A while back, I think it was CareCut was the main one that was doing a lot of calling and texting. So we're starting to see that, and it's really hard in the negotiation phase of it as well, is when you're getting involved in talking to the threat actor, going back and forth, and you make the comment, and even breach counsel approves it and says, yeah, we can say it. It's something like, yeah, we'll get back with you. We got to talk to our board. Everybody has bosses. We got to talk to our board of directors. And then the next thing you know, the board of directors is being looked up and they're being targeted for text messages. So, you got to be careful of all that. We see a lot of that, but it is very disrupted to a certain degree because people are getting these phone calls, getting threatening messages, and it happens quite a bit. But that's what we are seeing a lot as far as certain threat actors are doing certain things.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I am seeing a lot more of the ransomware attackers reaching out, not just to the employees, which is what we used to see. More so I'm seeing the CEO's wife or family members are getting attacked, and that adds a whole new layer of pressure to how do we make this stop? How do I make the threat actor stop harassing my family members, my customers, everyone else in the community? Because that's really getting the word out that we're a victim of a breach and we have to get moving on everything else that follows, the notification process and providing services.
And I think one of the key words that she said there was pressure. So if you think about it from the adversary's perspective, what is it that they're doing here? They are running a criminal enterprise that's a business. And so they are trying to put as much pressure on you or your clients to pay. And the other thing that was mentioned earlier today that I think is apropos is adaptability. This adversary is going to adapt to the circumstances. And so when this first started 10 years ago, what were they doing? What were we doing? We were advising to have backups and test and restore from those backups ahead of time. Well, they adapt. And so then they did the double extortion where they went and extracted data from you. And so they held that ransom. And now they're into the triple extortion where they're going to harass you, your company, your suppliers, because they are trying to put pressure on you to make that payment for you. And I think the biggest trend that we're seeing now is that very often we aren't even seeing encryption happen. We are seeing the straight data exfiltration, and that is what they're extorting you over. And we'll talk a little bit later on about what you can do about that and some of the concerns there.
I love it. A nice light topic to end our day with. You know, in the most common terms, these guys are becoming jerks. We've had situations where they're threatening the lives of family members of executives at companies, and that just places a whole lot more pressure on those companies, and on us and on the insurance carriers to move forward with making payments where perhaps we would try to negotiate for a longer period of time. Those CEOs are really feeling the pressure, and at the end of the day, they don't want to be the ones responsible for harm coming to a family member, someone completely disassociated from the business. It's changed the way that we've had to deal with threat actors when they do reach out to customers, do reach out to employees, because we have to get ahead of that. The last thing we want is our clients to have 100 different fires they're fighting. It's one thing to message internally, but we're sharing information probably before we really need to, or before we would really want to. So we're having to navigate these evolutions in the threat actor tactics, but it's very hard to predict.
Yeah, I think especially when they're talking to customers or clients of the victim, and then now we're having to bring in resources on the forensic side to help meet up with all now the touch points with the customers and providing the indicators. So Brian, you mentioned the criminal enterprise aspect, and I want to touch on that as well. So what we're seeing is this large shift in how they operate and what their MO is. We saw with the Conti leaks, right, before Conti broke up. If you kind of read in depth, it mentioned that just one division of the Conti enterprise had around 80 individuals. And I think one of the toughest individuals to have in your enterprise is a malware author, somebody who actually writes the code, writes the ransomware. Maybe not with ChatGPT coming out if it's going to write novel malware. But that's the toughest individual to have. And what we're seeing is that there's some criminal enterprises who are not even encrypting. They're just doing the smash and grab, just stealing the data. We've talked about CLOP. We've heard CLOP a lot all day. But what are the different challenges that we're seeing with the CLOP, with the move it, or just with a data exfil component? And are we seeing that as a successful extortion tactic? We'll go in reverse. So Greg, we'll start with you. Yeah,
sure. So I came with some statistics. We see as a firm between 3,000 and 4,000 incidents on an annual basis. This year, the pace is probably at the 2020 levels or close to it. And just looking at the reasons why our clients are making payments on ransoms, a third of the time it's just for the deletion of data. So it is still a fairly compelling issue for the threat actors to take that information, even though they have backups, they're able to restore, recover. They still feel that pressure and end up paying.
Yeah, and then I guess so. I don't know how familiar you guys are with the operation that we had not too long ago against Hive ransomware. It actually, their covert operation started just about a year ago. We were at our cyber. This is about the time that we felt like we had a possibility of getting into their network. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, we were sitting in their network for about 7 months. FBI got access to their control panel. And so for 7 months, we were distributing decryptors out to and offering them to every single victim of Hive ransomware. We thought that would go on for a day, and then it went into 2 days, and then a week, and then months. In that time, I can't remember the exact number that we distributed, a couple hundred that people took them, and we saved about $130 million in ransom payments from folks. They went from having a revenue in a couple $100 million over a 9-month time period to a revenue of $10 million. And I mention that because that $10 million, those people had the decryptor, and yet they still paid. And why did they pay? They paid because of the data. They wanted to make sure that the data got deleted. Now, the earlier panel talked about this. Just because they said they deleted it does not mean that it happened. And when this exfiltration happens, it goes from one server and then gets put on additional servers across the globe. So it's not even that one place that it's sitting there. We've had some success when people call early that we've actually been able to go and hit that first hop and pull it back. That's based off the timing, so another reason why you should call law enforcement right away. But once it gets out there, those copies are being made, and it may come back and hurt you 2-3 months from now or 3 years from now. And one concern that we have right now is what we are seeing that we hadn't been seeing is the exploitation of the data that is in there now. Before, it was just a matter of smash and grab. I got it. Now I'm going to extort you. Now what they're doing is actually looking at it. And that is a scary proposition because of what's going out the door.
Yeah, and I am seeing a lot more of just the encryption, or not the encryption, we're seeing the theft of the data. I'm having clients that are receiving an email that found out that the threat actor has been in their environment for months and sending the demand that way with screenshots of the data as opposed to the typical ransom note that we had been seeing previously. Of course, we always recommend against issuing a ransom payment, but 9 out of 10 times it's either because they need that key back to restore their environment and the business interruption loss just makes sense to pay that, or they're concerned about that data getting out and impacting their reputation, so they want to make sure it's deleted. But like Brian just said, we're dealing with criminals, and we tell our clients that there's no promise that you're going to make this payment and it's not going to show up down the line somewhere or in someone else's hands.
Yeah, I agree. And somebody made a comment earlier about the encryption, the process, and how fast, or if the decryptor will work. You know, one of the things we talk to all of our clients about is during the time of the event is encryption is ugly and decryption is even uglier, because you never know what you're going to get at the end. So we even had at one point a client ask, well, why, if I pay, go ahead and just pay the ransom, you know, in the decryptor, if it works or they don't work, can I just get my data back then? Because all the data that they took was my important data. So I get it back, clean it, and I can put it back in my online. And, you know, obviously that's, the data is a big hot topic. You know, there has a lot of impact in them from a company perspective. They may or may not have any good backups, may not have ever tested their backup. So, yeah, I see that a lot here lately is, you know, the main thing is not necessarily about the decryption part, it's more about the data.
And like Larry said, you're dealing with those issues where the decryption key doesn't work, cutting that out where the threat actor just gets their money and then they're gone. They don't have to deal with us, or having Max and his team following up. There's an issue with your key, and the communication's going on for another 2 weeks. This is a little bit easier of them to just get in, have the data that they know is important, and be done with the victim.
Did we have one quick question?
Not a question, but really just kind of just something to add here is that I would agree that we don't always know if they're actually deleting the data after payment. We've seen at least 6 different character investigations where we're negotiating with them. Of course, they don't encrypt, right? They exfiltrate the data. Where we've been able to access their own servers, which of course has been reported to the FBI, but we're able to actually confirm that data is on a specific server that does not belong to the policyholder. And there's been one instance where we have made a payment to that particular variant and then went back into that server to see if they've actually deleted that data, and they haven't. And they still haven't, and it's been over 6 months now. So that it's quite plausible. Now that doesn't mean that's every variant, but at least for the character variant, we certainly urge extreme caution when we're talking one-on-one with the attorney before it's taken.
Are you saying there's no honor among thieves? I'm aghast.
Yeah, unless they just run out of room to store it because they're taking so much. But so as we look at these groups and the evolution, we were at a point, I would say 2 years ago, where we had great attribution. You look at Conti, you look at these other groups, you say Russia, North Korea, you know exactly where they were. We had the huge realignment, we had these new groups popping up, and attribution becomes very difficult. And I think one area that gets forgotten too is that we're looking at a ransomware as a service model, right? And so we associate key indicators, key tactics, and we say that, oh, this is associated with Conti. Well, the reality is that these are contractors who may shift groups and take those tactics with them. And now what you thought was linked to Russia is actually just a threat actor who's now working for another group and is no longer associated with the prior group because they're getting a better payout. But how has attribution of late been playing a role in investigations that we've been working, and what are some challenges that we're seeing on that front?
So, and over the last year, we have seen a lot of new threat actors come up, and it's very hard to go through and identify, they're affiliates. They're not the actual makers of the ransomware. And a lot of them are going out on their own and trying to make their own ransomware or their variant. They're trying to make their own name. So we're seeing a lot of them come up almost daily. So it makes it very difficult to tie back, or if you can't get a copy of the actual malware that's on the system, if you can't get it to analyze it, it makes it very difficult to be able to say, this is clearly this from this group, or this is this researcher or the developer that made it. And it makes it very hard as they come up, because there's been times that we've had to go through the negotiation phase completely all the way to the end and then potentially have to make a payment and still don't know who the actual threat actor is. So it makes it very difficult to go through there and be able to identify, because so many are popping up every day.
Exactly, and like you said before, there's no honor among thieves, but it used to be that this was a business model, and if we have one specific ransomware variant that we know, this is Conti, and if Conti doesn't give us what we're asking for, why is anyone going to pay them going forward? But that's so kind of increase the risk of making payments to these threat actors, because we don't have any history with them. It could just be some ransomware as a service, someone in a basement that hasn't done this before, doesn't know the protocols exactly with how we're doing those negotiations. It used to be you open up the chat, I ask for a list of exfiltrated data, and sometimes that's all we want. We want to know what they have, so that helps us with the notification obligations. But we're not always getting that, or now I'm starting to see where they'll give us a 5% list, they'll give us a 20% list, but they know that that's what we want, and we're not getting it.
They all say, trust me.
Of course.
We'll give you your data back. Just trust me.
I never thought we'd see the day we'd say we miss Conti. At least we knew what we were dealing with.
Well, I actually look. I'm an optimist, which is funny because I'm an Irish Catholic, so it should be actually the other way around. But what you're seeing here is ransomware as a service has been around for a while, and this goes back to the adaptability. They had a business model where they needed to trust the name of, if you deal with this group, this is what you can expect in this situation. There's been a lot of pressure that's been put on the adversary over the last year and a half. In a whole of government approach. And so I will tell you that you should feel good as a citizen of the actions that are being taken by your government and governments across the globe on this. And I think that is some of what we're seeing a result of that, is that you're seeing some breakups of these groups because in some ways they can't trust each other. And so then they're going on. Now that means that that's a different thing that we've got to adapt to on it. But they no longer have that structure they can rely upon, and there's a discord that's saying, hey, can I trust that when I do this as an affiliate, am I actually going to get my cut, or is he going to stiff me on the backside of this? And that's a good thing for all of us in this space. The key is we've just got to keep the pressure on the adversary, and that comes from us as well as then from the private sector helping us.
And Brian, I'll stay with you for a second there. So what can we do to help you in those situations?
Early engagement. It was said earlier, and I don't think we could say it enough, of you've got to call law enforcement right away. In the example of Hive, what was great about that was we had access to the control panel. And so we could tell who all the victims were, and we made efforts to go out and speak to every single one of them. We don't have that every time. I will tell you that Hive is not the only decryptor that we have access to. And that there are hundreds of millions in decryption capabilities that we've been able to share with the private sector and save money for them. But it only happens if you call us. And so that's either call us, call Secret Service. We don't care who. We just want you to make that phone call, because the longer you wait, the less likely we can help. To include, I think it was talked about on the last panel, of the ability to then extract ransomware payments. That is also based off the timing. So the BEC is really a 24 to 48 hour window where if you let us know at IC3, we have a 70% chance of getting that money back. And so last year, I think we got 474 million in BEC. Ransomware is a different story. It's a tougher one, but in the high profile ones that you've seen with Colonial and Sodinikibi and the Kaseya attack where we pulled that money back, we got wallet access or wallet identifiers right away. We have a lot of really cool tools that we can't talk about here that we're going to leverage. But if you wait 6-7 months, we may have lost the opportunity, and now we're going back to that spider web on the backside of it as opposed to looking at it in a proactive way.
I think just the point I want to make is ransomware as a service is unpredictable. We're going to see a whole lot of different tactics from different actors, all under the same name. Lockbit, you don't know who you're going to be dealing with on the back end. We've had situations where those operators are not fulfilling their end of the bargain, and I don't know how they did it, and I don't necessarily want to know how, but we went to the main operator of Lockbit, the I guess call it the parent company, and told them your affiliate's not doing what they're supposed to, and it actually moved the needle and got things back on track.
Actually, I had a matter
HR.
where we paid the ransom demand on a Lockbit matter, and within days they got reattacked. And we messaged them and say, "What's going on? We just paid you. Why is this happening again?" And they reached out and they said, "We're sorry. It was one of our affiliates, and they're no longer associated with our organization." They kicked them out as a result.
So, sorry, do you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add one other thing. He was talking about notifying law enforcement. Somebody made a comment earlier about making payment and doing your OFAC and sanctions check against a sanctioned entity. Obviously, it's good to have good contacts with law enforcement, both Secret Service and FBI, to collaborate with during that time of your sanctions check, because they have a lot of information that we might not be privy to at the time. Having that conversation back and forth with them actually helps. I don't say we won't get in trouble by paying ransom, but if you collaborate and work with the FBI or Secret Service on that, it will reduce the risk a little bit. And when you go through that, you might find some information out about a threat actor that you didn't know before, and you have information now at hand to do your appropriate checks with.
And that's a mitigating factor in the OFAC sanctions, is if you have notified and have collaborated and cooperated with law enforcement. So just for that reason, it's really good to make that call.
So pivoting off of paying ransoms, and the easy answer to the question I'm going to ask is usually going to be hospitals on ambulance diversion. But what are the circumstances that you're seeing more likelihood situationally for an organization to pay ransom?
Well, of course, if they don't have backups and they're losing more per however long it's going to take them to restore than what the actual demand is. Sometimes it's just a business decision. Other times, they need access to that data, or they're concerned. I had a university make a payment just because they were concerned about some litigation documents that were in there and the potential repercussions of that getting out to the public. I know what you've seen, Greg.
It's certainly reputational harm. In the cases where they have backups and payment is made, it's either because of the data that was taken or because the recovery time to rebuild or restore their backups, because great, they have backups. They never figured out what it would actually take to bring them online and how long that would keep them down. And we tell them up front, look, it's not overnight. Even the decryption key is not an overnight solution. You were encrypted overnight, but you're not going to be decrypted overnight. So you have to weigh that balance. And more often than not, we end up in a negotiation phase where we may get to the end of it, and guess what? They were able to get their systems back online. We actually didn't have to pay. But they don't know that. They're panicking. So we try to run down both avenues to see what's going to get them up and running the fastest.
And from what we're seeing, I wouldn't say by industry, but we're seeing the ones who are paying the most are the ones who are panicking. The ones who are ill-prepared for this event to happen, and they haven't thought through it. And they haven't said, oh, well, who am I going to call in law enforcement? Do I have outside counsel? Do I have an incident response firm that we're ready to engage with? Have I thought through that scenario of, okay, am I going to pay? What's our policy on this? If you haven't thought through that, you're going to end up making a payment, and you're probably going to make a payment that far exceeds what you probably could have negotiated down, because they're taking advantage of the fact that you aren't prepared. So get on the front end of this, think through what's that scenario, what's your policy going to be, and now it's just execution of that plan that you pull off the shelf. And I will tell you, pull it off the shelf, not from your hard drive, because too many people, we've seen these on tabletops where we've been asked to participate, and they say, well, let me go check. And we're like, is that on the computer? Yeah, no, it's out. You don't have it, so who are you making the phone call to? And they're done, so.
It's right next to the insurance policy, right?
And one thing too is when I get on the phone calls with our clients, I'm opposed to making a payment or advise making a payment, because at the end of the day, I feel like my job is to advise breach counsel and the client on what information they have in front of them that I have and knowledge-wise through the investigation course of the collection of intel, and provide them with all the tools that they need to make an informed decision on whether to pay the ransom or not. Because at the end of the day, it's not my decision. I don't think it's anyone else's decision. It is the client's decision to make, with all the informed decision from breach counsel, law enforcement, and us, the forensics firm, to be able to advise them with the information they need to make a payment or not.
So Kelly and Greg, is there any industry where you might get a case and you say this is more than likely going to be a ransom payment, more than the others?
I think you mentioned it before, with the HIPAA-covered entities are always a little bit more concerned about their data being out there. And I think the schools is what I'm really seeing that want to issue the payment. They don't want their students' data out there, especially the private universities. How is that going to impact their enrollment next semester? That's usually a big issue that I'm seeing.
I mean, the top 3 industries that we see targeted, number 1 is professional services, year over year, last 5 years, number 1. And my statistics are current as of May, so who knows with MOVE IT if that's changed. But second is manufacturing and distribution, and those are the entities that I see often panicky and needing to make payments faster, or wanting to make payments faster, because they're losing tens of $millions a day because they're unable to ship, they're unable to fulfill orders, and it could lead to downstream issues with the folks that they're supplying.
So looking at how these threat actors are actually entering the network, I know that there's one key area for me personally on the forensic side that really sticks out as far as headaches go, as far as challenges, and that's when, and really trending heavily lately, is when they're directly on the VPN. They directly have their system inside the network. And really it's tough because what they're doing is you now have that threat actor system inside of all the firewall rules, right? And so all the forensic evidence that you would usually pull from a system that they compromise to get in the network, right? Exploiting an Exchange server, getting an email attachment onto a system, usually there's great artifacts on those systems to analyze. And when you have that system on the VPN, just with credentials, they can access all these file shares, right? And there's a lot of different routes for them to pull down the data, to pull off their exfil, and there's way less artifacts. Is there any other ways that you're seeing them enter the network, or any that stick out that have presented difficulties or challenges of late? Perhaps ones that don't have patches released, or difficult decisions that have to be made in terms of business interruption to take this offline. Greg?
Zero-day exploits are the flavor of the month now. I mean, all these data aggregation companies, the MOVE ITs, the Go Anywheres, quote unquote zero-day exploits on their systems. But a lot of it's still originating with phishing. Just going after the weakest link, and it could be a website that they visited or an email that they received, but without the proper protections in place, they're capturing credentials and getting into the network. I don't think that's going to change.
Yeah, I think the credential issue is really the thing at play here. Something I've seen a lot more this year is the compromise of an API key or something in their code that allows a threat actor to get into one of their applications, maybe even a SQL injection, and they're able to capture that data. And like MOVE IT, they were capturing it for months and then go on and make that ransom demand, just moving away from the typical encryption that we used to see.
Yeah, and I want to say sometimes I'm surprised at what I'm seeing when it regards to the way they're getting access to the environments. But then you go back and look at it and you're like, you scratch your head, it's like there's no controls in the environment that we're seeing. Nobody, I ain't say nobody, but there's a lot of times they go for the low-hanging fruit. They don't try to, you don't see as much sophistication getting into some of our clients, I don't say ours, but clients that I've worked in the past, they don't have to go after those API keys. They don't have to go after try to find a hard way in. The front door is standing wide open. They just go right through it. The business email compromises are, that somebody said they're on the rise. I think they've always been on the rise for a long period of time. It's the simplest way to get in. A lot of times they just hand over credentials and there's no compensating controls or any controls whatsoever in the environment. We see a lot with no MFA. We see a lot with just no other email security program. There's a lot of that. So when you can walk through the front door, why do you got to make it hard and try to figure out how to tunnel under? You can walk right in.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Is that the things that we are seeing? We do see, certainly MoveIt was exploited by ransomware actors, but the zero-day exploits are few and far between the traditional spear phishing, remote desktop protocols that they're leveraging. It's the basic stuff. And so we as individuals and your users on your system are part of the solution and the problem here. And so the more education you can have about the good hygiene, the good practices, to make sure that people are doing the right things and the really boring fundamental things, but they actually make a big difference. We just had the Genesis Market takedown. I don't know how familiar with Genesis Market, but it's one of the most prolific initial access brokers out there, where you could go in there and for less than $1, I could buy access to a ton of systems, because people had their computers infiltrated personally, and then it was able to pull their digital fingerprint down and then push it up to Genesis Market where it could be bought. Well, sometimes those were credentials for the companies. And so then they're just buying that, and then that's their access from one of your employees that gets them into the system, and now you've got a ransomware problem. So basics of phishing emails and those campaigns to test people on it are critically important.
And credit to the law enforcement community, because in the last 2 weeks, I've had multiple clients come through the door that are coming to us not because they got encrypted or because they had data stolen. They got a call from CISA or the FBI and told them, look, there's credentials that are being sold on the dark web. We think you have an issue.
All right, and I think we need to move into questions now. Do we have one right here?
So rather than an action in response to an attack, what are some preventative measures that you would suggest companies take to mitigate the risk of a cyber attack or ransomware?
Yeah, and so the question is around what preventative measures can a company take to prevent or reduce the risk of a ransomware attack. I think a lot have been covered today from my perspective, and you can't say them enough, right? Not just meeting the basic requirements of having multi-factor, but ensuring that there's enrollment in multi-factor. Not just having the EDR, but make sure somebody's watching the EDR. Walk through your tabletop exercises. Scan the perimeter. Fix the changes. Not just identify them. And I'll give everybody else a chance to respond.
And changing your passwords, having a strong password policy with your staff. Too often I hear that they haven't changed their passwords in 10 years, or after the incident we tell them they have to implement MFA, and hear how much of a pain that is for them. You really have to get it out there that these are just some basic security measures you could take. Another important thing is making sure your backups are up to date and not anywhere connected within your environment that they may be impacted, because that lessens the need for the decryption key.
I mean, from the recent clients that I've seen, the issues that are popping up are legacy systems. They're trying to improve their security, but they haven't completed that process. And there's old servers that are still online that don't have the MFA, or they don't have the EDR solution in place because whatever, name the reason. I even had a client that replaced their whole firewall with the next gen firewall, and their IT department was doing something, testing a new system. The firewall didn't accommodate that, so they brought an old firewall back online, and 2 days later they got hit with ransomware. So, just making sure that they're educated about, if you're putting security in place, it has to be, across the board. There's no gaps, no allowances, no matter how, if your executives are screaming that they don't want to have to, hit, approve on an authentication, tough. You got to do it.
And I'm going to say something that you never thought you'd hear from an FBI agent, so I'm not sure that I like that this is being recorded. Think like a criminal. You know your network. You know the holes in it. You know what can be exploited, and then if it is exploited, what the damage can be done, and protect against that. Too often we see people who, they rely upon their IT department for their security. This is not an IT problem. This is a business problem. They don't know what that data is and how it could be used and exploited. They don't know if that's M&A activity that would be revealed ahead of the market and someone could engage in insider trading. You know that because that's your department. And so you need to be thinking like a criminal And then talking to your IT department about how do I protect against this? Because if this goes out, we're no longer a going concern.
Yeah, and you made a point there. One thing that I see a lot is you got to know your environment. There's been so many calls I've been on with, IT directors, CISOs, and when I ask, the simple question of how many systems are in your environment, you wouldn't believe my answers you get. Sometimes, couple hundred, okay. And when you finally get there, it's like 400 or 500. So really knowing all the assets in your environment, what needs to be protected, and then do some of the basic controls, put them in play. Security doesn't have to be expensive to be effective.
But it's also important not to assume your IT department knows what security means. Right.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. I think that this was an excellent talk. And Jason, we will turn it back to you.